Okay, well, I want everyone to welcome Amy Kasuga Folk. She likes to call Amy Folk. She is the author of a new book. She's author of many books, but this one, Rum Running in Suffolk County. It's an informative lecture about rum running. Now, it affected us here very much. A lot of fortunes were made. There was a lot of hardship too. She records an extensive nature in business and the risks that were taken. Now, I've read this book, really quite fascinating. And what's really cool is a whole bunch of codes in the back. So these guys were very sophisticated. They ran a tight ship, and they didn't all get caught. So they went to quite elaborate means to keep our throats wet during the era of prohibition, which lasted about 10, maybe, was it 11 years or 10 years, Amy? It was 10 years, I thought.
It's a
how
little
many?
over 10 years, more like 13.
13 years. 13 years. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I was drunk for the last two. Okay. Amy comes from has quite a bit of credentials. She is the archivist and collection manager for Oyster Ponds Historical Society, Southold Historical Society, and Suffolk County Historical Society.
I actually left Suffolk County.
If it's been recorded, Amy knows. Now, Amy also is the Southold Town historian now and past president of the Long Island Museum Association.
Yeah.
Well, Amy, what do you do in your spare time?
Yeah. No, I try to clean my house occasionally. That's what I do in my spare time.
Overrated. All right. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Amy, and I'm going to hold it up. So, wrong way. Rum Running in Suffolk County.
Hey, oh.
Yes, Tales of Liquor Island.
Okay, so let's get started. That was a fabulous introduction. Thank you very much, Paul. Rum Running in Suffolk County. When I started this project, I was probably like most of you. I had heard various stories about rum running in Southold, and most of the stories involved unnamed local residents sneaking alcohol in from offshore boats. And what happened to the liquor after it came ashore was never really specified. Some people said, well, of course, it went to the local restaurants and bars. But rum running is one of those topics. It's wonderfully mysterious. So, of course, I couldn't resist looking into it. And I was really surprised by the scale and complexity of the topic. But before we start, let's take a time out for a quick clarification of vocabulary. For the purposes of this talk, rum running is a transportation of alcohol on the water, and bootlegging is a transportation of alcohol on the land. So since I'm a historian, you guys are just going to have to bear with me. We're going to do a little background history because that's what I do. If I can get my computer to cooperate. There we go. From very early in history, mankind realized that sometimes water was really dangerous to drink. Egyptian wall tombs show that some of the earliest images of man making alcohol are brewers making beer. This image is from the Met, and it's the Old Kingdom Dynasty 5, and it shows bakers and brewers from about 2000 BC. Since the process of making beer kills bacteria, men, women, and children commonly drank mildly alcoholic beverages such as small beer, which is the equivalent to some of our modern light beers. Drinking was so ingrained in society that one of the earliest definitions of a grocery store was a groggery or saloon. Many local store owners capitalized on the social function of their enterprise by providing alcohol and non-alcoholic beverages for sale by the bottle for home consumption or by the glass for immediate gratification. During the 19th century, Americans made a differentiation between wine, beer, and all other alcoholic beverages. Beer and wine were regularly drunk as part of an adult's daily routine, and they were regarded as being benign. Other forms of alcohol, such as rum and brandy, were considered to be intoxicants. By the 1830s, drinking was a well-established social ritual, and the average adult in the US consumed between 4 and 7 gallons per year. In comparison, in the 1970s, the average adult only consumed about 2.5 gallons a year. So our ancestors were a little pickled. Beginning with the beer drinking Germans in the 1820s and moving on to the 1850s with the potato famine, Irish Catholic refugees, Americans began to fear what was seen as a foreign alcohol swilling masses flooding into the country. These newcomers came with different cultures that not only viewed drinking differently, but they also drank different types of alcohol. Many feared that these newcomers would not only take away their jobs, but they would drink their wages away and abandon the welfare of their large families onto the backs of hardworking Americans. These foreign attitudes towards drinking would then infect the innocent young men of our country, and we would end up as a nation of drunkards. These fears were mixed in with the sermons of ministers stating that drinking led to a moral decline, it led to poverty, and it damaged one's health. This mixture of fears not only threw support into the temperance movement, but also into the anti-immigration organizations. And while the temperance movement started in the 1820s, it wasn't until around the Civil War in the 1860s that the movement really began to gain popular support. By the 1870s, movements like the National Christian Temperance Union, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Washingtonians' Sons of Temperance, swelled across the nation, and the movement took a hold to various degrees across the country. In places like Orient, the population had a little bit more of a religious bent, and temperance was a natural fit for them. Despite the name, it was the goal of the temperance organizations not to temper or limit the use of alcohol, but to prohibit it. And while the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibited the production, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors, it did not define what was an intoxicating liquor or provide penalties. The amendment gave the government the power to enforce the ban by appropriate legislation. And by 1917, America was sucked into the First World War, and temperance supporters in Congress managed to insert language into an agricultural bill to ban the sale of liquor to our soldiers. In 1919, at the conclusion of the war, a bill was introduced into Congress. The bill, which the Anti-Saloon League helped to write, was named for Andrew Volstead of Minnesota, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, who we see here. The Volstead Act was created to carry out the intent of the 18th Amendment and established prohibition. Enacted in 1920, the bill, while supported by many temperance members, really turned out to be a pain in the neck for the rest of us. So when you think about the Roaring 20s, in comparison to the centuries before it, the 1920s was a major revolution. We have skirts shortened, women's hairstyles shortened, attitudes about relationships and what could and could not be done in public alter, and society begins to change radically. For the first year, prohibition was regarded as an inconvenience. Most businesses that served alcohol either changed their business models, or in some cases, clubs and wealthy people had stored a large supply of liquor in bonded warehouses, and technically, according to the law, they could continue drinking from their supplies until they ran out. Medical exemptions were offered for patients that doctors determined that alcohol would help their overall health. Yay, high blood pressure. But the government monitored the number of these exemptions that were given out, and a drink known as near beer and wine, which had an alcoholic content of 2 3/4, remained legal. People in the US started to get really thirsty, and a number of people began to make booze in their homes, like my maternal grandfather, for home consumption. Others saw a bigger, more commercial way to cater to the growing thirst, and a cat and mouse game starts between the government and the owners of a new type of business, the speakeasy. On the East End, we called them as blind tigers, and if we happen to be in Detroit, just as an aside, they called them a blind pig. I don't know why they picked those names. Did you ever think about where liquor comes from? Well, in the 1920s, we imported most of our hard liquor from Canada, Bermuda, Scotland, and France, as well as a number of other countries. Understandably, prohibition affected not only America's, but also the international beverage industry. Businessmen, seeing the new but rapidly growing market, set about filling the need. And at first, it was relatively easy to smuggle in a crate or two. But then the government created the Prohibition Unit, and they tasked the Department of Treasury to work with the Coast Guard to enforce the law. Now our story starts to take a darker turn. One of the laws of business states that where there's a need, someone's going to step up and fill that need and probably make a quick buck. Prior to Prohibition, New York City's criminal element consisted of street gangs who ruled over their own small neighborhoods. Prohibition changed all that. This man you see here is Arnold Rothstein. He was the black sheep of a wealthy German Jewish family from the Upper West Side. As a teenager, he worked as a translator between immigrants in Tammany Hall. A gambler, 38-year-old Rothstein soon saw the need created by Prohibition, and he provided the financing for several gangs to purchase and import ships of booze. His crews not only organized the ships to anchor off of Long Island shores, but they also gathered drivers and vehicles to ship the crates up to the city. And while it still sounds like a bit of a game ducking the law, these gangs were deadly serious about the business venture. Thousands of dollars changed hands with each shipment. To give you an idea of what I mean when I say it was big business, the gang took in an estimated net profit of $12 million a year from this business. On average, they paid $200 a week to 100 employees when the average store clerk took home $25 a week. And they paid $100,000 a week in graft to the police, federal agents, city and court officials, and still made $12 million a year in their business. This is Arthur Simon Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. He's born in New York City in 1902, and Schultz, like Rothstein, came from a German Jewish background. Schultz had a violent temper, and he made his fortune in organized crime, particularly in bootlegging and the numbers racket. Starting in the Bronx as a small-time hoodlum, Schultz was involved in a war for control of the city's beer supply, and he took over control of the importation of booze on Long Island. Joining Schultz in this group of importers, we have Waxy Gordon, Jacob Little Augie Organ, Jack Legs Diamond, Salvatore Lucania, also known as Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Sechowel Jansky, better known as Meyer Lansky, Francesco Castellia, better known as Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Vanny Higgins, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. We only missed Al Capone because he moved from New York City to Chicago the year before Prohibition started. I bet you some of these names probably sound pretty familiar. Eventually, these gang members evolved into the criminal enterprises we now know as the Italian, Jewish, and Irish mafias, and Prohibition is what gave them their start. In Southold, Ray Askin and Bob Gilbert were children during the 1920s, but they remembered some of these organized crime figures like Owie Madden, Two Finger Genovese, Frank Costello, and their men living in Bayview in the area of Southold to help oversee the smuggling on the East End. Bob Gilbert remembers visiting the headquarters of the Rum Runners, which was down the street from his home, and they would let him shoot their automatic weapons at a post in the yard when he said it was a little nipper, and I think he meant he was like 9 years old. So he said he managed to cut the post right off at the base. He was so happy, and I was like, oh my God, who let a 9-year-old loose with an automatic weapon? Holy cow. So, how did this work? Groups of investors from both sides of the ocean would buy a shipload of liquor to either be delivered to a specific customer or for sale to anyone who approached the ship, or a load could be a mixture of both. These ships would anchor outside the territorial waters of the United States, which in the 1920s was 3 miles off the coast. Later in 1924, the line was moved to make it a little bit more of a challenge to 12 miles off the coast. The line of ships that anchored there was known as Rum Row, and small, hopefully fast boats would go out to the larger boats, pick up or purchase crates of liquor, and then run them back to shore, hoping that the Coast Guard didn't spot them. Once on shore, the cargo was transferred either to a vehicle for transportation to its final destination, or it would have been hidden locally until it was safe to move. The process of rum running was simple, and it was easy to romanticize, especially since the gangs weren't the only ones importing from overseas. However, remember, this was a big business for some very unsavory people. Ships anchored were periodically boarded by pirates who would rob and then kill everybody on board. On shore, Dutch Schultz's gang hijacked and killed anyone whose vehicles they suspected of transporting any significant quantity of booze into the city. And that was just the criminal side. The federal government was, in some instances, just as violent as the gangs, and it authorized officers to stop, search, and detain anyone they suspected of violating the Volstead Act. The Prohibition Unit, which was first the arm of the Treasury Department and later became part of the Justice Department, along with the Coast Guard, was authorized to use deadly force to enforce the Volstead Act. It's estimated that nationwide, several thousand innocent bystanders died in the enforcement of the act. Let me give you an example. If we were all together at East End Seaport, and you were driving your car home after a meeting such as this, an unmarked car pulled up behind you or next to yours, and the guy in the car who's not in uniform orders you to pull over. If you hesitated before pulling over, and if the car was actually being driven by a Fed, they were authorized to use deadly force, and in some cases they did. In addition, federal law rendered these officers untouchable from prosecution because they were acting in the course of their job. And that's why they have the nickname, the Untouchables. That was a lot of background. So if you even in passing heard about rum running, you've heard about people such as Bill McCoy and his rum running business. And he was one of the people who was anchored off of a rum row on our coast. However, please realize that the rum runners landed their small ships all over Long Island. And the general goal was to move the booze from Rum Row up to New York City. The newspapers were filled with stories not only from the North Fork, but also the South Fork, and as far west as Huntington, Patchogue, Port Jefferson, Freeport, Long Beach, and even Sandy Hook in New Jersey, as well as other places. Eventually, the gangs realized that landing the cargo on the East End and running it up west was riskier than trying to land the cargo closer to the city, or even better yet, sneaking it directly into New York Harbor. But since I'm the historian in Southold, my examples of places where you could go and get a drink at, commonly known as a speakeasy, or to use the word blind tiger, of course, all my examples are Southold examples. So here's some of the local places where you could have gotten a drink. And literally, because we're all locals. The spot in Southold, it's on Ackerley Pond Road. The house still stands. At one point, Ackerley Pond Road was nicknamed Broadway because it was so busy with traffic all going to the spot. The owner of the house wasn't very happy with this identification because along with getting a drink there was a bunch of loose ladies who were all looking for clients and they were mingling with the crowd. He was not happy with me. The Worthwhile Lodge in Peconic up by Goldsmiths Inlet, there was not only drinking, but there was also dancing. Lake Lodge, also up in Peconic by Goldsmiths Inlet. Both of those buildings still stand as private houses now. The Old Mill in Mattituck, which had a trapdoor in the floor where the boats could pull up under the building and pass crates of booze up into the bar. And as far as I know, while Rum Runner boats were twice mentioned in passing going through the area, the old mill was never raided. Everybody knows Claudio's in Greenport, which also had a trapdoor. And the second floor above what is now Bruce's was also reputed to have a blind tiger, as well as a stage. And the last time I visited there, which had to be a good 7-10 years ago, the stage was still there underneath the front windows, the 4 front windows that we see in the picture. Okay, so now some of the fun stuff. There's a number of stories about rum running, and we're going to hear some of them. Please bear with me because some of the stories are a little bit long, so sit back and sip your drink and relax. One thing to remember, the Volstead Act was enforced by the federal government and not by the local law enforcement. And in many of Long Island's shoreline communities, the local police were just as involved in smuggling as the residents. Patchogue Police Captain William H. Valentine must have radiated a sense of authority that affected all that surrounded him. As he was walking down the street in Patchogue, a car whizzed past him. Bellowing at the driver to stop the car brought instant results, as Joseph Powell of Islip jammed on the brakes and pulled over. Valentine, who merely wanted Powell to slow down, caught up with the car and probably intended on giving the driver a lecture on the virtues of slowing down when in town. But then he noticed there was a blanket covering something in the back seat. Flipping up the blanket revealed 12 cases of liquor and Powell's arrest. Archimamic and Southold, Sheriff Asma W. Biggs was a dedicated lawman. A resident of Huntington, Biggs became fascinated with law enforcement when he got to know the local sheriff, who rented carriages and horses from his livery stable. In 1908, Biggs decided he was going to change careers. He sold off his stable and he joined local law enforcement as a deputy sheriff. On Sunday, June 17, 1923, Biggs learns that there's a boatload of whiskey that had been landed at the dock in Greenport at 2 in the morning. The tip made no mention of where the booze had been stashed while awaiting transportation. That same night, Sidney Smith of Greenport, unable to sleep, went out for a late night stroll on a quiet Sunday, enjoying the peace. As he was passing the property of fisherman Captain Fred Davis, he saw a woman going into the house. The door soon opened again, and an unfriendly Davis appeared with a shotgun and fired at Smith, striking him in the face and ear with shotgun pellets. Injured and aggrieved, Smith notified Sheriff Biggs of the incident, and a warrant was quickly issued. Biggs assigned a group of deputies to begin observing the property. After a short while, the deputies spotted Ernest Martin of Hempstead, John Monahan, and William Calversert of Greenport driving an Eastern Auto Supply Company truck off of the Davis property. When the truck was stopped by the deputies, it was found to be filled with crates of liquor. Biggs suspected that the truck only had a portion of the haul that was landed at the dock and continued to have his men watch the property. The next evening, an estimated 60 to 70 professional New York City gunmen, all heavily armed, arrived at Fred Davis's house. The newcomers faced down the 8 deputy sheriffs, who were then powerless to prevent the removal of approximately 600 cases of Scotch and rye whiskey from a barn that was on the property. Clarence Downs of Sag Harbor and a group of friends narrowly escaped death when a gunman protecting gangs of bootleggers and rum runners confronted Downs and his friend. The group was heading home for a visit to Montauk when the driver made a wrong turn onto Devon Road and was heading down towards the beach in Amagansett. As soon as they realized their mistake and were looking for a place to turn around, Downs and his friends soon realized they were in a really bad place. A group of men with guns soon spotted them and began to brandish their weapons. When one of the gunmen leaped onto the running board of the car and began to smash at the window, the men were certain they would never see another sunrise again. The driver hastily backed out, turned around, and raced the car back down the road towards Montauk Highway. But leaving was not good enough. The gunman leaped into what was described as a high-powered Marmon car and followed, shooting at the fleeing automobile. When the car carrying Downs reached the turnoff, they tried to take the turn at a high rate of speed and flipped their auto 3 times before finally coming to rest. Although the car was demolished, the occupants only had minor injuries. The gunman, after witnessing the accident, probably assumed that the passengers were dead and turned around and returned to their post. Locals noticed that 7 large trucks loaded with liquor left from various points in East Hampton town that night, each heading towards the city, and the trucks were escorted by several cars carrying armed guards. As the net to capture bootleggers tightened and the methods of smuggling the contraband liquor across Long Island became increasingly elaborate, Prohibition agents Smith and Phelps got a tip that a cargo of booze had been landed 2 weeks earlier and was going to be moved soon. The haul was packed into 7 cars, and it was moved as far west as Eastport when word came down that the officers had been alerted and were searching for cars. The lead driver quickly turned back to Sag Harbor and hid his prize. Stymied in their search to find the elusive load of liquor, Smith and Phelps spent some time idly studying a green Ajax motor oil truck. The men had heard a story that a tanker had been used recently to slip a load of booze into the city. And searching for alternative modes of transportation, the lead driver of the illicit cargo had also spotted a green tanker truck emblazoned with the words Ajax Motor Oil. Thinking to disguise the truck as a legitimate business that worked across all of Long Island, he purloined the tanker and he painted it red and wrote Haviland Crude Oil on the side. He then reloaded his cargo into the tanker and set out. About a mile east of Lake Row on Middle Island Road, the truck was pulled over by some officers who said to the driver, "Hey, we need some gas." And he said, "Well, I've got half a can of gas in the cab. I'll put it into your tank." And as he's doing, he said to the officers, "I think your tank is half full. You don't really need the gas." And the agents who were inspecting his tanker said, "Oh, well, maybe our feed pipe was stopped up a little bit." And they looked the tanker over and noticed that green paint was showing through underneath the red paint in places. Suspicious of the tanker, but unable to figure out if it was carrying any crates of alcohol, the officers reluctantly let the truck and the driver go on its way. But as the truck pulled away, the officers compared observation. And one of them said, that truck driver had red paint on his overalls. Realizing that the driver had repainted the truck to hide it, the officers leaped into their car, chased down the truck, and this time they arrested the driver. And when they unbolted the cover on the tanker, they discovered that it was filled with 125 cases of liquor. Now, this particular tanker truck you see on the screen is the same year as that story. And don't ask me how anyone managed to get 125 crates into the back of that. 1924. The sloop Elizabeth Wilson of Greenport was brought to New London by the Coast Guard destroyer Jewett. Having been seized off of Block Island with a small quantity of whiskey hidden in a very large cargo of codfish. Can you imagine how much fish the sailors and the Coast Guard ship had to move to probably find that whiskey? I like to tell this story because what we see here is one of the Coast Guard boats. It is the Coast Guard Jewett. And when the ship itself is a lot bigger than what I imagined it would be when I started doing the research. And one of the problems the Coast Guard had when they started chasing after the rum running boats is that they were seriously outclassed, not only in speed, but also in maneuverability. It was so bad that the Coast Guard eventually began to absorb some of the faster rum runner ships that they captured into the government fleet just so they could go after the rum runners. In order to more successfully cope with the rum running, the federal government established a floating base in Greenport Harbor. And as the County Review newspaper account observed, it would appear that the government's planning to exert every effort to stop the rum running on eastern Long Island. but it is a fact that the abundance of liquor being brought ashore from the ships anchored outside the 12-mile limit and the rum running boats are having little difficulty in eluding the patrols. It's reported that prominent businessmen on eastern Long Island have made a fortune in this past year financing the boats that engage in rum running. 1925, April. Lloyd Hamilton and Edward Coleman went along with their girlfriends up to Bailey's Beach in Mattatuck by the breakwater at 10:30 at night on a date. Hubba hubba. Hearing a boat that sounded like it was run aground, they shouted out asking, "Do you need help?" So somebody in the boat said yes. The couples went to Peter Wyckoff's house to get a third man to help move the boat. And when they returned to the beach ready to help, what later turned out to be a Coast Guard patrol boat opened fire on the 3 men and 2 women with their machine gun. Then 3 men from the boat came ashore in a dory and began to shoot blindly with revolvers. Luckily, nobody was killed. The Coast Guard had been ordered to Mattatuck Creek to intercept a rum smuggling vessel. And later they claimed that they believed that they were being fired upon, and that's why they shot everything. Hamilton, who returned to the scene the next morning to get his car, said that he spotted crates of liquor lashed to the Coast Guard's deck. 1925. In August, the Coast Guard base moved to Nantucket because they felt that they had the east end of Long Island under control. Hans Furman at Greenport and his friends found an exciting way to make money. But best of all, they also had access to lots of booze every time they went to work. Unfortunately for Hans, while he made a good salary, he was drinking his paycheck away as quickly as he earned it. And not everyone was happy being part of a rum running business. Hans's wife, Annie, was more disgruntled than most because her husband usually returned from his voyages intoxicated and broke instead of bringing his pay home. Rather than nag and argue with her husband about his habit of drinking his entire pay from each voyage, Mrs. Furman decided to go to the source. So she contacted her husband's bosses and demanded that they give her at least part of his salary instead of giving it all to him to drink away. Annie said that Hans's employers only laughed and said, "It was my funeral." Well, I wanted to make it their funeral too. Annie realized that the best way to hurt the rum runners was to hurt them financially. So she wrote to a reporter at the Brooklyn Eagle and said, "How can I get the government officials to listen to me about this?"
I could ask you the same thing.
Soon, the Prohibition Enforcement Bureau from the Department of Justice sent a special undercover investigator to hear Mrs. Furman's case. Mabel Willibrand, the U.S. Assistant Attorney General, who was in charge of handling all prohibition cases, became involved. Annie Furman began to work closely with the government investigation, telling them all that she knew about the operation. And when she learned that her husband had been recently jailed for violating the Volstead Act again, she closed up her house and she moved temporarily to Brooklyn. When she was reunited with her husband, she convinced him to turn state evidence. So Furman began to tell everything he knew about the operations of his employers. And Mrs. Furman, who had been present at several of the meetings held in her home, also told how the smuggling leaders used her house as a temporary base to plan, hire, and pay employees. She provided authorities with names, addresses, and a wealth of details. So much so that the government put her on payroll and made her a special investigator and paid for all of her living expenses while she spent her time in Brooklyn. The information that the Furmans provided led to raids on the headquarters of the smuggling ring at the Longacre and at the Knickerbocker buildings in New York City, and it also led to the surrender of the ring's leader, Arthur Krause. During the raids, Hans Furman stood with a group of officers as each member of the syndicate was arrested, and they were brought to the group, and Furman identified them by name and stated their occupation. 6 months later, Hans Furman was found dead with a bullet to the head, and his murderer was never found. A Pierce Arrow pulled up to a stop at a hotel in Smithtown. The driver, hungry, wandered inside for a bite to eat. And upon learning that one of the hotel guests, Patrick McInerney, was going to catch a train to Brooklyn, he said, "Hey, rather than catch a train, I'm heading that way. Why don't you catch a ride with me?" The passenger probably soon began to wonder about his good fortune as the driver began to accelerate down the road, going faster and faster. Just west of Huntington, the Pierce Arrow pulled out into opposing traffic to pass a slower moving vehicle and smashed into Patsy Mastriani, who was driving home to Huntington with his mother and nephew, Natal Leone. The Pierce Arrow overturned and the front end tore off, while Mastriani's car was almost ripped in two by the force of the impact. Surprisingly, no one was killed. The driver of the Pierce Arrow, after a moment of shock, quickly recovered his wits. He crawled out of the car and began running back towards Huntington. He soon flagged down two other Pierce Arrows, both loaded with crates of booze, and crawled into one of the vehicles, leaving his passenger still stunned inside the wrecked car. People who stopped to help soon smelled the odor of scotch, which perfumed the air. Apparently wedged out of sight between the front and the back seat were 20 cases of liquor, of which 125 bottles survived the accident. The officials later imparted that they believed that the Room Pierce Arrow and its driver were part of an 18-man liquor hijacking crew that had been operating in the Huntington area. In February 1930, it's cold, we know February, the Coast Guard got a call that a beam trawler, the Notice, was in distress in the South Forks Oyster Pond. The Coast Guard captain, Frank Warner, immediately went to investigate. The ship with Adolf Steinfeld, the owner and captain on board, was beached in about 4 feet of water. After searching the ship, he found it to be empty of any illegal cargoes. A suspicious man, Warner decided to arrest Steinfeld anyway and called to New London to have the Notice taken into custody and towed the ship to port. By late afternoon, 2 Coast Guard ships, the Eagle and the Nemaya, arrived. The crew from the Eagle was soon set to work in the freezing water to search for the cargo that Warner was sure had been on the Notice. Soon, men began bringing up liquor, bags of liquor. A total of 330 out of an estimated 400 sacks were found and brought to shore. As word of the Coast Guard men searching the water spread, crowds of residents, armed with clam rakes, eel spears, and nets, began to appear along the roadway. They were all set and ready to help search for the cargo from the beached ship. As residents began to approach the beach, all set to collect whatever they could, the Coast Guard patrol on the beach turned their guns on the crowd. William Petty, who was among the crowd, along with Richard Bennett, Kenneth King, Arnold Holtz, and Al Garrow, said, the officer of the patrol stated, as the Coast Guard men got back into their boat, "You people get behind the bank and stay there. We're leaving, and we're going to spray the shore with machine gun fire if you move." Petty said, "We thought he was bluffing, so we ran down to the beach. And all of a sudden, there was a noise like a lot of hornets, and sand and water began spitting up. We got out of there quick." The Coast Guard began to spray the beach in front of the crowd with machine gun fire, and anyone, including curiosity seekers, who attempted to move past the hills of the beach towards the water was shot at. This quickly brought complaints from the crowd to the sheriff's department. And when the deputy sheriffs spoke to the Coast Guard official who was in charge of the ships about the shootings, the officer declined to comment because the Coast Guard, like the prohibition agents, were, in a word, untouchable when they were performing their duty. Owning waterfront property near a dock is not as pleasurable as you might imagine. John Crampton and his family had their home in the water near Bishop's Dock in Patchogue. And for months, the Cramptons had been working hard to ignore the regular nighttime deliveries made to the dock by the house. Then in December, the police got a tip-off about the cargo, and they stopped one of the waterborne deliveries. A short while later, on New Year's Eve, Crampton, who was entering his yard after a late night, was surprised when 2 men with guns appeared and ordered him to leave and not come back for a while. Crampton, noticing a boat docked near the shore, said he just wanted to get to his house. Please, just let me in. 5 days later, another large boat appeared, and the men swarmed around his property. Hunkering down the house, Crampton and his family worked really hard at not seeing anything, even though they recognized some of the local men. But the gang was taking no chances. They cut the phone lines to the house, and a day or two later, the family received in the mail an envelope posted from New York City. Inside was a newspaper clipping of an article about a bombing that occurred in New Haven, Connecticut, at the home of a suspected federal informant. In the margin, written in blood, was a message that Crampton would also get a pineapple, a name for a bomb, and he better keep his mouth shut. Frightened and distressed with the threats, Crampton quickly packed his family off to stay elsewhere. Then he went to the police and the district attorney's office to plead for protection and assistance in ending the situation. The situation must have been resolved because there's not another word that was ever written about Crampton or his family. While most of the alcohol that was captured and reported in the newspapers on Long Island came by ships from other countries, Federal Agent Wilbur was in Huntington when he received a tip that not far from the commercial district of the community, there was a garage on Wall Street that had a large still set up. Gathering up Deputy Sheriff Asma Biggs and his officers, the authorities quietly approached the suspected site, surprising 3 men who were operating a huge distilling plant. They got a crew of prohibition wreckers. They were dispatched to dismantle the 2,000-gallon still and to destroy the rest of the plant. They found 48 barrels of booze in the basement of an adjacent house, and they emptied it. The authorities saved the cans of liquor that were waiting to be shipped as evidence. Angelo Ulano, the owner of the property, and 5 other men connected to the operation were arrested. And what we see here is not Ulano and his still. Surprisingly, most people in the past had the common sense not to photograph or film themselves doing illegal acts, unlike today's world. Some of the stories collected by the Oyster Ponds Historical Society in Orient are some good ones. Joseph Dorowski related to a friend that when he was 18, some guys came to him after school and offered him cash to go to Brown's Hill. There were no houses up there then. A boat would land there at night, and a whole bunch of guys would line up from the beach up the hill, and they passed the cases of liquor all the way up to the top. All of a sudden one night, the whole place lit up with a Coast Guard ship saying, "Stop what you're doing and don't move." Dorowski said that when he heard the machine gun, he took off running to his father's house and crawled under the barn and stayed there all night, and he never got paid for the job. I had to say one of my favorite stories I've ever heard in passing was not so much about bringing liquor ashore from Rum Row, but it's about the Hedges barn in East Marion. Located on Bay Avenue, Henry Hedges and his sister Jessie ran a duck and chicken farm. In their barn, they incubated their chicks and had a number of gurgling pipes overhead that served a dual purpose. They not only kept the barn warm for the incubators, but they were also connected to the whiskey still that was in the back. 1931. On a quiet August night, the Artemis was a really fast speedboat from Greenport, and it was sighted by the Coast Guard off of Orient Point at midnight. The Artemis, which was somewhat typical of a rum runner ship, was 52 feet long and had 3 Liberty engines. The ship could do 45 knots, which in landlubbers terms was about 51 miles an hour on the water. When ordered to stop by the Coast Guard, the Artemis sped up, hoping to outrun its pursuers. The patrol boat opened fire and shot more than 100 rounds into the fleeing ship. At least 30 to 40 struck the Artemis and 2 of her crew. John Johnson and Captain Carl Ryder, both of Greenport, were wounded in the onslaught of gunfire. The Artemis, after enduring the barrage of bullets, turned and rammed the Coast Guard cutter, crippling it on the port side before escaping the patrol and landing on the beach in Orient. Scrambling to get help for the wounded comrades, the crew woke up 2 nearby neighbors to take Johnson and Ryder up to the hospital. According to the reports, Johnson had been shot in the head and Ryder had taken 6 bullets to the body. As the injured men were taken to Eastern Long Island Hospital, their cargo on the Artemis was hastily unloaded. Some of the liquor was loaded into 3 dories, which were later caught. Investigators realized that some of the crew must have been hit in the hail of bullets, and they went to the hospital to make inquiries. A fast-thinking local doctor saved Johnson and Ryder from investigators by claiming that their wounds were part of a hunting accident that happened earlier in the day. The remaining crew moved the heavily damaged the Artemis with the help of the fishing boat Evangeline quietly up the Sound to Port Jefferson. In this picture in Port Jefferson, you can just make out the boatyard among the jumble of buildings. Everybody see it? All right, give you a little help. There's a boat, and that's where the boatyard is. Prohibition officials had set investigators to watch most of the boatyards along the Sound for the ship, and William Philibach, the DA in Port Jefferson, spotted the ship on the Long Island shipyard in Port Jefferson Harbor. Philibach reported that the Artemis was a scene of chaos. The cabin was strewn with glass, 1 handle of the wheel had been shot away, and 9 machine gun bullet holes were counted in the windshield. 4 of them were directly behind the wheel. Both sides of the Artemis had been riddled by bullets, and 3 planks on her port side for a distance of over 6 feet above the waterline had been stoved in. Philibach and 5 other deputy sheriffs guarded what remained of the boat while authorities tried to figure out if they had the ability to confiscate a vessel which was in dry dock and did not have a drop of booze on it anywhere, although they could smell it in the air still. Possession of the ship hung in limbo until mid-September, when the ship was seized for non-payment to a bill to one of the Greenport shipyards. The ship was eventually rebuilt, and it ended up as a ferry on the South Shore. So if you ever went to Fire Island, you might have ridden on the Artemis. Some young men from Watermill soon found out that bootlegging was a very dangerous business. The organized crime factions, which was running the importation of alcohol in the East End, were intent on keeping a tight control on the business and doing away with competitors. A bitter feud had broken out between competing gangs working in Sag Harbor, East Hampton, and Southampton. In June 1931, a group of young men were socializing late at night in Southampton when suddenly they were forced into a car at 1 o'clock in the morning. Herbert Miller and Mac McGee, realizing that something was very wrong, managed to escape the car before it started down the road. William Kelly got away from the kidnappers when the car pulled into some woods, and the 2 remaining youths, Thomas Farrell and Jacob Antley, were dragged into an abandoned house in North Sea, and their kidnappers proceeded to beat and torture them by branding them using a red-hot potato masher heated in an oil lamp on their faces, necks, hands, and feet. The gang accused the young men of hijacking a load of liquor from their gang several nights earlier. At dawn, the pair were dumped near Southampton. Henry Thiel, Charles Walker, Frank Alfred were charged with the crime. Joseph Stinson and Betty Mack, both from New Jersey, were held as possible accessories since the accused were reputed to be staying in a house that Simpson and Mack had rented. Walker was later acquitted. It's possible that the gang managed to buy the silence of the 2 victims because later during the trial, Thomas Farrell testified that a very large Filipino man who was never caught was responsible for torturing him. I've never heard of a Filipino guy on the East End, at least not that time period. It's possible, though. 1932. Around and around Plum Island they went. The 55-foot liquor boat in the front and the 75-foot Coast Guard boat close behind. By its longest dimension, Plum Island is barely 3 miles long, and there are dangerous spots for navigation on all sides. But since it was night, neither boat could recklessly cut corners. It all started when the Rum Runner came idling along. It saw the Coast Guard boat, and it turned off at Fort Terry and slid around Plum Island. The Coast Guard boat followed slowly at first, and then both boats started to pick up a little speed. Eventually, the Rum Runner slowed down and permitted a search. There was no liquor on board. There had never been any liquor that night. The Rum Runner in question was only a decoy, because behind it, at a respectful distance, was another speedboat with 800 sacks of whiskey on board. At a signal, the second boat had swung south as the Plum Island chase had began, and then went in through Gardner's Bay, and then finally into Peconic as it landed its cargo in Greenport. While the newspapers enjoyed dedicating space to breathlessly reporting the capture of various bootleggers and rum runners, rarely did they dedicate space to the closure of speakeasies that were found throughout the county. However, early in May 1931, Prohibition officers headquartered in Bayshore turned their attention to these illegal bars. Orrin Meade, the lead enforcer in Suffolk County, had his men raid the former Yaphank Grange that we see here while a dance was in progress. Under the fascinated gaze of the dancers, John Tanks, George Baker, partners and proprietors in the site, as well as former Special Constable John Bennett of Farmingdale, who was acting as a bartender, were all arrested when officials discovered 28 cases of beer and bottles of whiskey on the premises. In the basement of the hall, the agents found a distillery with vats of mash. That was not the only dance that federal agents crashed that night. Later on, after breaking up the dance and distillery at Yaphank, the agents traveled to Medford Community Hall and arrested Edward Hare for possession and sale of liquor. The same group also visited the Bohemia Hotel and arrested owner Cyril Chauvenac. So as you can tell, there were even more local stories about rum running, from people finding suitcases with bottles of alcohol in their garage for ignoring the rum runners, and bootleggers' activities to active participation in smuggling. On April 7th, 1933, it was all over. Many historians credit Nelson Rockefeller with swaying public opinion enough to have politicians repeal prohibition, and the grand experiment was done, and many citizens across the United States breathed a sigh of relief. So these are the books that I used, some of the books to do the research. I always like to show you that I was actually reading, didn't make this up. And as Paul was showing earlier, this is the book. So does anybody have any questions? I did see earlier Sarah Sands said hello. Hello, Sarah. Let me see.
Okay, Amy, I have a question.
Sure.
The name Frank Costello comes up. Now, I know that we have Costellos in Greenport, and I just want to know if there's any distant relation.
No, as far as I know, there is not.
Okay, good.
Amy, this is Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, how are you? Costello's maternal side is Ryder, which was also mentioned. So that makes,
Yes.
it sort of adds to the mystery.
Yes. Yeah, the writers are still around. In fact, I talked to Carl Ryder's, I believe it's his grandson, when I first started doing these lectures. He's the family's still around, and he's the one who said to me, the ship wasn't called the Artemis, it's the Artemis. And I said, okay, I'll remember that for the future. And he gave me, some information, family information about, what happened to Carl Ryder and how they would actually run the boat. It was very interesting that Ryder realized that the machine guns would, kill everybody on his ship. So what he did is he actually inset the compass and the steering mechanisms into the floor of the Artemis. So when they were being chased, everybody hit the deck, and he actually could steer and see where the boat was going from his belly. And they all laid flat. So it really is amazing that two of them were still shot up, and they were laying flat on the floor while they were being chased. Pretty neat stuff. Any other questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, two questions. One is, do you have any sense of proportion of how much escaped enforcement versus was caught? I mean, we're talking about 5% was caught and 95 went through, or 50-50?
I would probably guess in the beginning it was probably proportions like 5% and 95 went through, and then later in time it kind of tipped closer. I don't think it was ever 50-50. I think
Uh-huh.
probably they got most of it through. It was just impossible to cover everywhere. You have to remember that um, you're dealing with um,
It's a big,
hundreds of people working this racket, and you have only a limited number of officials, because remember, the local cops are not enforcing this. It's only enforced on the federal level with the prohibition agents and the Coast Guard. So they did have some volunteers. There were some people who came up and said, we don't believe that this should be going on, and they volunteered to help snitch on what was going on in their local community.
Well, that leads to my next question, which is socially, were the people who were involved with the rum runners considered marginal or outlaws? I mean, how would you compare it to the way people are discussed now in the press about if they're running cocaine or other drugs? I mean, were people, was this kind of a norm and nobody thought very much about it or had a moral opinion about them?
I think it's a mixture. I think for people who were temperance members, they were certainly against the smuggling and importation of booze, and against people drinking it. For everybody else who was not a strong, it was kind of like the minority ruling the majority, I think, in the case. So for people who were not temperate and didn't believe in prohibition, this was just a stupid law that they were going to try and get around, because everybody was trying to get around this. And that's why they eventually gave up and said, it was called the grand experiment, and it did not work out. But it was a case of the minority ruling over the majority of people.
So Amy, this is Sarah again. Growing up, we heard lots more stories about rum running than were in your book.
Sure.
And so it makes me wonder if the North Fork people were a little more cagey and never got caught. Because there aren't as many newspaper articles about them getting caught. So I just, is there any way to capture that information?
People have tried to capture it over the years. In the book, I went with primary source documents. So primary source newspaper articles about who got caught. That's what I went through with this. But there are stories, and I can't confirm the stories. Sometimes they're, second or third generation from the people who actually participated. Probably in the 1960s and 70s, there were historians out here trying to capture what was going on. But the penalties for rum running were so severe that there were a lot of people who were worried that if they admitted to being a participant in this, that they would lose their house, they would lose their car, because they did confiscate whenever they caught rum runners. They would confiscate, if they caught you in the car, they would take the car. If they caught it in your house, you could lose your property, so on and so forth. So people didn't want to talk about it even years later. So that's why sometimes all we know are the kids saying, yeah, dad said this or dad said that. We do have some stories that I didn't include, primarily because it would be difficult to footnote. The milkman that went through Southold apparently not only sold milk, but he also had booze in the back of the milk truck. So you could get either your whiskey or your milk, your choice.
Strong coffee, yeah.
Yeah, strong coffee. Do you know, during Prohibition, guess how many police officers we had in Southold town?
One.
That's right, one. That's right, Patrick Kelly, right? And Pat Kelly, his dad was a rum runner. And one day, somebody must have tipped them off, because the Prohibition agents went to their family farm and they searched the farm and found that they had a trap door in the garage floor that led to a tunnel, and they had booze at the end of the tunnel. So they arrested Kelly and his dad, So what does the town supervisor have to do? He has to suspend the only cop that we have for all of Southwold town. And he said, well, I'm going to suspend you until, until you're done with the trials, and we'll see how it goes from there. Suspends Kelly. I can't find any word on whether or not he was convicted or not. However, Kelly does come back to Southold and is reinstated as our only cop for years. And he eventually retired in the 1960s. Still, they did have a little bit of a force going by that time, but it was pretty late. He remained our sole cop for decades.
Well, where was Biggs? Wasn't, because Biggs is a Greenport name. It's a different
Yeah,
Biggs.
He's from Huntington. Asna Biggs is from Huntington and lived up there his whole life, but he did travel all around Suffolk County in pursuit of rum runners and bootleggers.
There's another question in the chat room. Was there any connection to what is now the wine industry on the North Fork?
No, the wine industry only started when Louisa Hardgrave and her husband came out here. And that was what, in the 70s, I believe it was.
That was the 70s. Yeah, that was.
Yeah. It was no connection.
73, I think. Yeah, 73.
Yeah, but taking a page from how the rum runners operated out here, you might recall, I believe also in the 70s, we had a guy who was smuggling in marijuana, and he was using the exact same method as the rum runners to smuggle it onto shore. Yeah.
Well, as a kid, I remember there was the occasional bale on the beach. There was what they call it, swamp pot or something like that. I don't know what they call it. But there was an occasional bale, and of course, rumors and innuendo and things that you can't prove as an historian because
and also one of the names that you mentioned earlier, his grandson was involved in that.
Oh, I don't want to know. Don't tell me. Tell me later.
I don't want to hear. Yeah, there's a lot of.
Tell me later.
Being of that age, there was a lot more than you think.
I don't want to know. So I was talking to Rodman Pell. He's up in his 80s or 90s and lives all the way in New England now. And he was telling me when he was a kid, his family used to go up to the cliffs of the Sound to watch the rum runners being chased by the Coast Guard. And one day they're up there and they're watching the rum runner go zipping past, and they see the guy, he's throwing the cargo overboard. I guess he didn't want to lose his boat. And his dad says, you know something? I know exactly where those bottles are going to land because there's this eddy right in that area, and I can get to that. So they wait until the Coast Guard and the rum runner go away, and his dad gets out the rowboat and he rolls out to this area in the Sound, and he starts diving, and he starts bringing up the bottles, throws them in the boat, and rows back to shore. And the family grabs the bottles out the rowboat and they run to their house and they hide it in the house. He said that stash bought him his first trumpet, because one of the things to remember, the tail end of rum running is the beginning of the Great Depression, and there's no money. So they actually used those bottles of booze as cash. They bought their first radio with it. He bought his trumpet with it, and it helped them get through the Great Depression. So there's some really neat local stories and I could only include so much. They limit you on the number of pages you can put in to these books. So I had to pick and choose, and I had to make it about all of Suffolk County. So some of the neat local stories, I said, all right, I can't particularly do that one.
Well, I in your book, Amy, and we didn't really speak of it during this presentation, but the use of the radio, the shortwave radio and things, that was just amazing. It'd be like, imagine if they have internet. Like now the stuff is like, you could use TikTok, for goodness sake, to get information around. It was pretty fascinating. Fascinating.
One of the things to remember is those radios are not small. They're huge. They're enormous sets that they're hauling around and installing. They're also not two-way. You could broadcast out, but you can't, unless you have another huge set, you can't broadcast in. So early on, when they were using the radios, they would actually they would have codes set up, and they would call them into the commercial radio stations and saying, hey, could you say this to my buddy? Kind of a thing, to say what they wanted. And then later on, they started getting the guys with the shortwave radios, even women with the shortwave radios, to actually broadcast the orders. Okay, this guy wants 25 bottles of this and 2 bottles of that, and so on and so forth. You know, so it was a really organized situation.
This is just totally fascinating. Hey guys, buy the book. I read it. It's really good. Amy, I can't thank you enough. This was a really good presentation. I hope all of you who are watching got something out of it. And hey, if you really have stories, pass them on. Amy would be glad to hear them. You know, we may not be able to get them in a fact book, but we can certainly get them in a hearsay book. Boy,
well, we can keep them in our files until we get enough. But I'm in the town offices in the town annex on Mondays and Fridays, if you ever want to stop by. Not this Friday, because I have to go pick up my son at school, but most Fridays and Fridays and Mondays, I'm in the office.
I would really like to see this theoretically come out of the closet, because being slightly involved with the history of Greenport, I hear stories and innuendo and.
Well, you got to write them down. Did you write them down?
And sign them with blood. Yeah. It's be very interesting to actually, you know, have an overview of what's going on. I mean, I heard stories. One of the wonderful stories that I heard, now, can't say that it's true, but there's the fact that boats would come into one of the unnamed shipyards and be hauled out of the water, and the Coast Guard would come up and not have jurisdiction when the boat was out of the water. Now, Amy, we spoke of this earlier, and you said that, well, yes, but they were the feds. Now, you and I know that Long Island is named Long Island for a reason. It's pretty skinny, and you can't be everywhere. So I imagine there was a lot of sneaky Pete's going on here.
There's a lot of sneaking going on. Yep.
Right. Well, thank you, Amy. I believe we've reached our limit of time. Wait, we have a great presentation. Thanks for the presentation. Wine industry. Well, I hope I have answered all your questions. Amy, what a great, thorough presentation. Thank you again. This is Paul from the East End Seaport Museum and Maritime Foundation.
Thank you, Amy.
Next time.
You're welcome. Have a good evening, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.